3 men settled in this area in 1786, midway between Athens and Atlanta, Georgia, reflecting the attitudes of early pioneers as they made their way west. At the time, the interior of Georgia was still owned by the natives, and the situation on the ground is reminiscent of the later Wild West period in American history. Much like earlier technically illegal settlements of the state of Franklin and Watauga in eastern Tennessee, these settlers offered payment to the native chiefs directly. In this case, they bought land off of the chief of the creek, Umasaga. Here they traded beads and pelts, so the creek called it bead land. And after nearly a decade of peaceful white settlers living amongst the Indians right up the stream from the creek villages, the state of Georgia contracted the Humphreys brothers to build 4 forts throughout the state to protect from increasingly hostile Indian raids. Remarkably, this fort still stands near the lake. There have been restoration projects made to it, but this is the original fort, and these are the original timbers. And this would have been a blockhouse to protect people from Indians if a raid were to take place. And you can actually see the ports that would have been made to poke muskets out of in case a raid actually happened. You can see nails on the side of this fort. They would have been used to kind of pound up notices way back in the day, but not in the day this fort was used in the Indian Wars. Rather, they built this using the dovetail style, and this would have made sure they didn't use any nails, because back in the day, nails were actually very hard to come by. And as the building settles over time, the wood kind of slides into itself. So it guards against water making its way inside of the blockhouse, and it only gets stronger over the years. I think it's actually a really resourceful technique used by the old pioneers. And by the way, the original chimney here would have been made of bricks or something else, but this is kind of a reconstruction. So the only part of this building that isn't original is the chimney. Originally, this fort probably would have been in the middle of a field, and you can get a real idea of how well it would have defended people by trying to envision yourself as somebody trying to raid the settlement. You can come up here to the front door, but you would be shot at from up here. So if you make a mad dash right now, where I'm going, you can see another musket port here. And if you manage to duck underneath this area and make your way around the stone chimney, you might think you're home free, but here again, someone is leaning out and shooting at you. And by the time you make it around here, you can probably see a port there. And if you think that you're being smart by hiding down here, you've got another port right up there. And also the door could open up and settlers could jump out at you. This is the old Fort Strong Cemetery, established 1834, home to the grave of Josiah Strong, an early settler in this area not too far away from Fort Yargo, as well as his wife, Bana, whose story is fascinating. I believe she's the descendant of Spanish expeditions here, particularly led by Juan Pardo. And it's also here that I wanted to tell the story and how this all ties into probably one of the most haunted areas in Georgia, an area called Nodoroc, which is Creek for Gateway to Hell. Umasaga was a Creek man who sold the area around Fort Yargo to early settlers, and I wanted to clarify he wasn't necessarily a chief, but came from a settlement of Creek near Columbus, Georgia, and was very widely respected. His father was a chief there, and the reason he saw fit to sell this land that was turned into Bead Town was twofold. Firstly, he married off his adopted daughter to the settlers, so there was likely good feeling between them. Secondly, the Creek feared this nearby swamp, naming it Nodoroc, or Gateway to Hell. After converting to Christianity, he warned the settlers of a beast called the Wog, which lived in the swamps with red eyes and a long tail. Umasaga's adopted daughter is probably one of the most fascinating parts of this entire story. Her name was Bana, meaning princess, because her father was called King Americides, a Spanish nobleman who probably left his post and found his way to the Indian tribes, initially the Cherokee. I believe he might have been a mixed blood who descended from the men left behind in the interior of North Carolina during the Juan Pardo expedition, following the Ponce de Leon expedition. Pardo references leaving about 15 men behind in a fort, and these men are never mentioned in Spanish writings again. When Americides was adopted into the tribe, he told the Cherokee his name was Don Mar de Vido. He died in a Creek Cherokee battle at a place called Numerado, and his wife lived with him. Her name was Ellendine, a white woman who was apparently rescued by the Creek from a shipwreck. She too would die in this battle, but her daughter was taken by the Creek and named Bana de Mar de Vido, a Princess Mar de Vido. Early settlers began arriving underneath a man named Josiah Strong, who helped establish a fort named Fort Strong, which I'm kind of looking at the remains now, not too far away from Fort Yargo. And the wife of Josiah Strong was married to them by Umasaga. Her name was Bana, and when they moved into the swamps near here, they found them deserted. In fact, they found a lot of abandoned areas, places that used to look inhabited, but were now overgrown with weeds. And Josiah found a stone pillar, or a pillar of stacked stones, about 8 feet at the base and 6 at the top, near the courtyard of the old village, which was called Snowdon at that time. And he asked the man named Umasaga about it. They said, "What was this pillar used for?" And he simply said, "Nire Nara," and he began crying and he turned away. He would comment no further, but the Creek eventually told them that they blamed the abandonment of the village on a creature called the Wog, who was seen here by settlers into the early 1800s. This creature was jet black with long hair. Its teeth were white and always showing. It had red eyes and a forked tongue about 8 inches long. This Wog creature would harass settlers through their blockhouses by sticking its tongue through the rifle portholes and making a loud buzzing noise which would drive their animals into a frenzy. Josiah Strong I've been trying to find, and his grave isn't listed anywhere here, but he established a fort along this area called Fort Strong, or at least his family did. And although they say that this cemetery dates back to 1834, no names are actually known from who's buried here, but it makes perfect sense that Josiah Strong would have been buried here, midway between Fort Yargo, which he helped to establish, and the Nodoroc itself, the Creek gateway to hell. It's very likely that I'm standing right on top of where Fort Strong used to be, which probably originally would have looked like an old blockhouse. It would have been a commanding area right on top of this hill. In fact, right beneath me now is an old abandoned well that might have been a refurbishment of the original Fort Strong well that was used by later settlers in the area, of course now long abandoned. And you can still see the remains of an old building over here, although that is probably more recent than the 1830s.